Did you know that you can change the past? It's true. Everybody can, and does, every day they live. The world for us is made up of much more than just a chain of events. That might be enough for simple animals, but humans see a higher truth. There are two parts to history, the event and the context. As an example, imagine a couple getting married. They stand at the altar and swear to be faithful to each other until they die. Standing where they did, speaking those words, that's unchangeable. But were they lying or telling the truth? At that exact moment, they were neither liars or truth-tellers, and both. It's like Schrodinger's cat stuck in its box, two potential states superimposed on each other. But say one of them cheats on the other. Suddenly, then, in the past, they were lying. The moment before they cheated, they weren't, and now they were. Does this sound fake? I promise it's not. I spoke of our world having two parts, physical event and context. We know that we can change the events of the future by how we live our lives. Exercise today, and that heart attack may not happen tomorrow. The event changes. It's the same with the context of the past. Succeed today, and your past defeats were simply what a successful person went through to get to success. Give up, and all of your triumphs were just a prelude to the eventual fall. The theologian C.S. Lewis said that those who make it to heaven will discover they have always been there, and their time on earth was simply the outskirts of their entrance to that radiant city. Every evil thing they saw, every tragedy, would become simply something that strengthened them, made them more ready for their eventual life in heaven. Likewise, it is accurate to say that Sarah Crouton has always been in hell. Not that she's surrounded by devils in a pit of fire with whips and screams. That version of hell is what's told to people who are so unreflective that all they could process is, you don't want to be in hell. No, hell is much different. Hell is smaller than that, much more personal. In fact, smallness and exclusion is what hell is all about. The properly lived human life sees them growing like a tree, from a seed into a towering mountain, always expanding, experiencing new things, connecting with others and becoming more complex. The religious among us see this as a human soul drawing closer to God and, as a result, closer to their fellow man. Hell is what happens when this growth is refused. It's rarely done for the traditional reasons that you or I might think of, a desire for evil, cruelty, or sadism. No. Hell is worshipping what would normally be a good thing, making it the center of one's existence, to the exclusion of everything else. It ends up as a monomaniacal, prideful, self-obsessed existence, unaware of others except when they trigger greed and jealousy. But it doesn't start that way. In Sarah Crouton's case, it started as love for her father. Sarah Crouton grew up the daughter of wealthy plantation owners. They believed very strongly in the things of the world. Thomas Crouton put little stock in things he couldn't see or trade. To this end, he drove his slaves exceptionally hard. There were many, many deaths on the Crouton plantation. And yet he was not a sadist. He simply saw pain and fear as exceptional motivators, and his plantation grew wealthy. He was not a particularly religious man, but he indulged his wife Mary, and tried to find what wisdom he could in the Bible. One passage in particular stood out to him, Galatians 6:7. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. Willfully ignorant to the world beyond economics and production, he never even thought to apply this to how he treated his slaves or his family. Not that he mistreated them. He was truly tender towards his wife and daughter, lavishing the best money could afford on presents, dolls, and clothes for young Sarah, and spending time with his wife walking and reading. He wished for a son, it's true, but he recognized in Sarah the appropriate determination to take on the ownership of the plantation. He would talk with her about the workings of the plantation, telling her stories about how he built it up from nothing. Not exactly true. The Croutons were a wealthy family before him, but he increased the value of the plantation at least tenfold, and how he would give it to her one day. To Sarah, who had spent her youth playing around the grounds, living in a wonderland, and being loved by her mother and father, this was a joy rather than a duty. Sitting in that playhouse, talking to her dolls, she resolved to become the best worker, the best plantation owner that she possibly could. It was then that she began to sneak out of the house to watch how her father ran the plantation. Something in her died when she saw him giving beatings, bringing a whip or a belt down on a crying man because he wasn't working hard enough, yelling and arguing with merchants, forbidding the slaves from learning to read, burning the Bible his foreman found in one of their huts in a rage. Sarah was resolute, though. She trusted her father, and thought that being hard and sharp as flint must be part of being a plantation owner. She was curious about the slaves and what kind of people they were. She would steal out into the fields behind her house at night to watch their huts, and one time she met a young boy named Eliezer out for a walk. It wouldn't be correct to say they became friends. He was too terrified of her and she of him, but they would throw pebbles into the field and ask each other what their lives were like. He was the only person of her age she had to talk to, and he became a confidant of sorts. It was because of this friendship that she learned of a man who was planning to help some of the slaves escape. She was with Eliezer when she heard him talk about stealing away in the night one humid summer day. She knew losing the slaves would cripple her father's plantation, but she also saw the scars on Eliezer, saw the tear in the eyes of the slaves, and heard their cries. This is as close to a moment of truth as many people would ever get in their lives. Spread before her were two good things: loyalty to her father, who loved her and had given her a place of esteem, who had bought everything for her and was her rock, or compassion to the orphans and the widows. Could she defy one that she had loved, possibly give up her birthright and disappoint a man that had meant everything to her for the sake of her own sense of justice, for an expanding of her mind beyond the confines of the plantation? She could not. She quietly smothered a large part of her compassion, telling herself that she would become whatever her father wanted her to be, whatever it took. Motivated by some mix of fear and love, she told her father what she had heard. The man came to help the slaves escape and found hard-eyed men with guns and rope waiting for him. He was hung several miles away from the plantation. Sarah had given up herself to become a plantation owner, and right at that moment, she lost it. Her father had been trying to shield her from the realities of owning a plantation and from the war between the states. While Mary, her mother, had favored telling her, Thomas was sure the war would never touch his plantation. The man trying to help the slaves escape had done so with the knowledge that the Union had taken New Orleans, and that the local militia forces would be too busy trying to organize to find him. It might have worked had it not been for Sarah. She screamed and cried when she was told she would be sent away to a boarding school, tears that faded into numb uncomprehension when her mother finally explained the reality. She wasn't at the boarding school 2 weeks before she could stand it no longer and stole off to see her home. She found her family dead. Her father, defiant to the last, had tried to fight off a Union patrol when they came looting, and the board troops finished off her family in some few moments of bloodshed. Inconsolable doesn't come close to describing her. She had built her life around the idea of owning that island, of carrying on her father's work, and now it was all gone. She couldn't accept it, and from that beginning, her world began to close in. Not that she lived much longer, mind you. She died soon after from pneumonia. She never found the note her parents left for her, never even looked for it. Her treasure wasn't gems, it was the plantation house. And so there she stayed. Sort of. Thomas Crouton had sown a crop of despair, of pain, and hopelessness. It came to fruit both in his slaves and in his daughter. But his slaves had each other, and they had religion. Oh, they hated Thomas. And in their hatred they turned to the creation of Grigri, of voodoo. It's not like voodoo was without power, there in the swamps, where generations lay dead and wounded, and families spent their lives in toil. But the ghosts of slaves are far better off than the ghost of one like Sarah. They had families to look after. They came to Sarah after she had turned in the abolitionist, who tried to free their sons and daughters. They accused her. Their cries were barely heard in the night, as they had no conduit, no means of communication. Sarah felt a little of their wrath and their guilt, but dismissed it mostly as the wind and the fog. See, voodoo is a conduit. The notion of passing curses or blessings on people is nonsense. It's simply a means of communication with the departed. And not everyone is interested in talking. The ghosts of the slaves, for instance, moved on almost immediately after the Crouton family met their end. Their relations, their blood left the plantation, and the bodies of the dead swiftly turned into swamp. The ghosts faded away, and all that was left was mist and rain. And Sarah. She had given herself to owning the plantation, and had killed the parts of her that wanted anything else. Sheer purpose held her to the plantation, purpose that turned to greed and envy and rage as the years went on. She saw everyone that came and went from her plantation, and she wished ill on them. She wished them to be gone, wished to take ownership of the place. and she saw the means to talk in the sewing needle of Seely Torre. The well-meaning cook was a voodoon and practiced voodoo, the way for Sarah to assert her influence. Unfortunately for Sarah, Seely was also a selfless, kind soul. What you have to understand is that Sarah had gradually become greed and selfishness. She was by this point a husk of her former self. This is the true horror of hell, what the human soul will become if it focuses inward too tightly. So focused on owning the island and taking what was hers, that she became deaf to all the abundance and vitality that makes a human human. She'd become just a ghost yard scream, just a gripping envy. And that was so different from Seely. It was like they spoke a different language. Seely couldn't comprehend her when she spoke. She only got vague bad feelings and would go to pray. But Seely wasn't the only one who dabbled in voodoo. Did you notice when the killing started that night? It was right after Lillian asked for a gree-gree, a voodoo doll. Did you notice that Lillian moved towards Sarah's playhouse? That she told you she could be friends with Sarah, and that you didn't really understand her? All this was because of the conversations they had. Well, not conversation exactly. Sarah communicated her greed and jealousy, and Lillian was far different from Seely. Mentally fragile to begin with, and very protective, to the point of covetousness of her uncle. Sarah's message took deep root in Lillian's mind. It was a strong enough push to refracture her fragile mental state. And in that vulnerability, in her innocent childlike state, she was pushed by Sarah to murder. She heard faint whispers, to push her aunt from a window. The whispers grew louder. To club an old man with a fireplace poker until he bled and died. The whispers were a voice, to strangle her cousin to death, add poison to a decanter of cognac, and, by this point, totally raving insane, to pound her own mother on the head with a rolling pin until she stopped moving. She avoided Seely. Perhaps it was the woman's kind nature that drove Sarah from her. Maybe her faith, or maybe her life as a voodoo was needed for the channel to the living to be intact. Or maybe it was Lillian's love for Seely that kept her away. Whether because of Sarah's direction or Lillian's emotions, Seely remained safe. Not Clarence, though. Lillian stabbed Clarence triumphantly, fear the man finally overcome by her desire to own her uncle, to make the past true. Because Colonel Dijon didn't understand the truth we talked about before, that actions in the present can change the past. By being rude to Lillian, he was, in fact, making her childhood utterly unhappy. He was submerging the one island of joy she'd had in her life with an abusive mother and dead father, with mockery and derision because of her mental state. Small wonder that she would do anything to get it back. She understood about the past. She thought in some small part of her mind that if she could make him admit that he had cared for her, then the past would be back to what it was before. Tolerable. Did you notice, by the way, that Rudy was looking for something in her room right before he inexplicably attacked the Colonel? Do you remember how selfish he was? How greedy? How fragile his mind would have been after a lifetime of gambling debts and the panic of being on an island alone with a murderer? Of learning that his sister and mother, the only two people he really cared for, were dead? He found the doll. And once he found it and had it, he heard Sarah, and he understood, and he killed. And then he tried to kill again. The timing never fit for Laura. She was an investigative genius, and knew that the pieces didn't add up. Why would Lillian go berserk and be lucky enough to escape all notice? It's as if she had eyes and ears everywhere. Why would Rudy attack the Colonel? He would have an airtight alibi with the word of the Colonel, and fully half of the money. Now with the Colonel dead, the police would have been much more suspicious. There's no telling that he would have got the money even if he had succeeded in killing Colonel Dijon. Laura obsessed over the case for years. She studied psychology, history, and eventually, almost against her will, the supernatural. She knew about the gree-gree, of course, as she saw Lillian with it, and it was found on Rudy's possession afterwards. That fact stuck in her mind, unwilling to be dislodged. Now, a decade after the murders, she had assembled all the pieces. She had dismissed all other explanations as foolish or flawed. She had learned of voodoo, and of Sarah, and had talked with Rudy in his cell, who spoke of a feverish rage. Most people assumed he was trying to evade blame by saying he wasn't thinking clearly, and he probably was to some extent, of course, but he held tight to his story nonetheless. Laura is going back now, back to the mansion, more willing to believe in the spiritual world than the last time she was there, more careful and deliberate. Seely's still there, though the Colonel is long dead. What will she find? Is Sarah still there? That is another story altogether, I'm afraid.